Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. The means to our end. The Brothers Frankenborg. America is the land of mindless rationalism. Freedom means that economic rationalism has been liberated from the oppression of the need for any higher justification. The great hope of reason and civilization survives through utilitarian lack of reflection upon its basic principles of freedom and equality. The time is coming, however, when the traditional capitalistic belief that greed will save humanity may be proved wrong in a fundamental, biological sense. The pragmatic reconciliation of capitalism and social equality characteristic of America won't work in this brave new era because pragmatism itself is becoming radicalized in the form of technological radicalism. Capitalism itself is breeding machines that may vastly exceed biological humans in intelligence and all other capacities. Traditional pragmatism is incompetent in a situation in which what works gains the technological ability to liberate itself from the constraints of biological humans. Human pragmatism won't work if the equality of man and machine is comparable to the equality of mosquito and man. At the forefront of those making sense of the long-term impact of technological change has been Ray Kurzweil. His theory of technological evolution traces the continual acceleration of evolutionary events on a cosmological scale, from the formation of the Milky Way, to the development of life on Earth, to the first mammals, to the emergence of Homo sapiens, to the advent of modern physics. The rate of evolutionary change has been accelerating. 1299 Kurzweil's law, the law of accelerating returns, makes sense of the decrease of time between successive evolutionary events through an ever-increasing rate of evolutionary change. If current developments continue to confirm this acceleration of technological evolution, a time will come when the exponential pace of change proceeds so quickly that technologically unenhanced humans will be utterly unable to follow it. By the end of the 21st century, Kurzweil predicts the existence of artificial intelligence trillions of times more powerful than all biological human intelligence combined. 1300. This is the singularity, the development of a greater than human intelligence that marks the end of dominance of biological evolution, and the beginning of the dominance of non-biological technological evolution. Kurzweil's optimism is firmly in the tradition of the original Enlightenment. His views radicalize some of its key assumptions, such as the predominance of nurture over nature, and the perfectibility of man. This means that Ray's views radicalize the more basic assumptions of the inventors of the liberal democratic system. Kurzweil's prospect for an integration of the individual body and technology is only an extension of what the Enlightenment did with the socio-biological body politic and technology. The merger of man and machine that Kurzweil predicts is a continuation, and not a contradiction, of the development of liberal democracy. Because liberal democracy is a political cyborg. To comprehend how and why this is the case, consider, once again, the strange death of Anglo-Saxon England in 1066. The destruction of the native Anglo-Saxon aristocracy by the Normans was a socio-biological decapitation. One can have an arm lopped off in battle and survive. But to be beheaded, as a nation or an individual, means the death of the organism. There is, however, a general technical difference between nations and individuals in that the cells of the national body are not physically connected and dependent. Consequently, when a political body is decapitated, it is possible that the cells of the national body can survive as individuals. If the Anglo-Saxon revolts immediately following 1066 had been successful, kinship-based organizations might have been able to heal themselves. However, the failure to fight off the unrepresentative, alien transplant overwhelmed their socio-biological immune response system. Despite outbursts such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, over the long term, the conqueror class incubated a breakdown and disintegration of the socio-biological body towards atomization and individualism. Individual freedom is the flip side of the death of kin cultural socio-biological organism. In short, Anglo-Saxon liberal democracy is built on a graveyard. America is built on the ruins of the broken Anglo-Saxon race. Broken as a race by the Normans. It is built on the failure of socio-biological self-preservation and erected on the remains of a broken Anglo-Saxon national culture. Democratic revolution is, in part, the remains of a partially broken down socio-biological immune system acting against the hereditary successors of that foreign, Norman graft. The formal, constitutional expression of the death of the Anglo-Saxon socio-biological organism is a core idea of modern revolution. Politically equal individuals. Equality allows for a bare minimum of order in what could otherwise be completely random relations of unrelated individuals. To discern the relationship between death and equality, imagine that cells within a human organism were organized on this bare minimum basis. It is at least conceivable that the individual cells could be kept alive by artificial mechanisms, but this bare minimum relationship of equality would by no means necessarily culminate in a single, organic human individual. A kin-selective uber-organism is founded upon the kin relationships between individuals, just as the coherence of a human mind is built upon the relationship between neurons, not an otherwise random summation of individual neurons themselves. With the decomposition of kinship relationships between individuals on the level of politics, the designers of the American Constitution would find the dead, raw material from which they would fashion a new form of life. From the death of the hive model was born the herd model or masses. Instead of a single, cumulative, aristocratic head of the body politic, a proposed educated electorate. This was to be democracy, a political cyborg that artificially and mechanically regenerates its head every 4 years according to the rules of the software program called the Constitution. Constitutional democracy is a political technology, a technological solution that cannot be understood without reference to the problems of Anglo-Saxon national experience which it solves. The Norman conquerors were an unrepresentative body imposed over the people that repressed its freedom to represent itself politically, and the American Constitution was, in part, an innovative solution to exactly this problem. An artificial and mechanistic system of checks and balances could be saddled onto the Anglo-Saxon body politic because it was filling the formal gap left by the Norman conquest order saddled onto them in 1066. Adaptation to that, unnatural government, and fear of false claims of natural government, primed the Anglo-Saxons for a new kind of unnatural government that could at least promise a mechanistic regeneration of a political head from the body of the people. In short, the constitutional system of the United States is very literally a socio-biological cyborg. To illustrate the origins of the American socio-biological cyborg with an analogy, take the 1970s television series, The $6 Million Man, based on the novel Cyborg by Martin Caidin. Its premise: an astronaut severely injured in an accident is partially rebuilt by the government with bionic replacements that enhance his capabilities. The United States Constitution is an analogous artificial self-reconstruction of the Anglo-Saxon nation, profoundly injured by the failure to prevent the Norman conquest. In many ways that political technology worked even better than the real thing, although the pre-modern kin culture it replaced was permanently lost. It was William the Vivisector who first ripped apart the organic Saxon folk, reducing it to a folk, and imposing over that folk artificial French-Norman civilization. Yet it was on the basis of this civilizational inheritance that Thomas Jefferson attempted to mechanically derive a folk from the Anglo-Saxon folk, politically dissected by William the Vivisector. That original organic order, however, was permanently lost. Civilization propped up a failed Anglo-Saxon political culture, and the result is the Frankenborg monster called the United States of America. The founding fathers of America were really the brothers Frankenborg. They thought they had discovered the secret to political life. In their experiment in rationalized government, dead, individualized parts are combined in the attempt to create a new form of political life. Immigrants detached from an organic manifestation of a living culture would be appropriated and assimilated within the system of human rights, an artifice of civilization. Injected with a chemical balance of equality and freedom, The creature was shocked into life with a jarring lightning bolt of capitalism. Akin to the energy released in atomic fission, the life energy of America is produced by taking the potential energy stored in the bonds of the hive and breaking it down into the kinetic energy of the individual. The genealogy of the English-speaking world's political cyborg can be traced to Thomas Hobbes, a materialist who concluded that life is nothing but motion of limbs and therefore machines or automata have an artificial life. He was the architect of one of the earliest designs of a socio-biological cyborg, the Leviathan, 1651. It is no accident that Leviathan was published the very year that the English Civil War ended. That war was the first great modern outbreak of the Norman-Saxon conflict. The individual was invented, more than discovered by Hobbes, as a technological means of opposing what can now be understood as kin-selective behaviors. It was these unconscious, irrational, genetically adaptive behaviors that provoked civil war. Hobbes discerned how individual fear of death, as a functional premise of political order, could be used to keep the peace. Individualism is thus the logical, and not accidental, structural characteristic of the modern cyborg because it counters biological inclinations towards genetic adaptation, opening up places for mechanistic or post-biological order. The origin of the modern political cyborg in Civil War is a key to understanding the cyborg evolution represented by the American founding. Just as Massachusetts was settled by the Anglo-Saxon side in the English Civil War, Virginia was settled by the Norman side in the English Civil War. While I have emphasized the Anglo-Saxon side because it ultimately predominated through victory in the American Civil War, the remarkable consistency of the anti-hereditary principles of the American founding is really a product of overlapping inconsistencies that effectually canceled one another out on a constitutional level. The South feared that Anglo-Saxon democracy would produce a new Oliver Cromwell, a re-emergence of hereditary Anglo-Saxon government on the basis of a Volkish, Nazi constitution-like tyranny of the majority. The North feared that Southern aristocracy would produce a new 1660-like restoration, a re-emergence of hereditary Norman government on the basis of caste hierarchy. It was this polarization of opposites in a latent state of civil war that produced the unusual anti-hereditary consistency of the founding. While each side feared the other side's intention to impose hereditary government, the net, constitutional result of this détente was formal, anti-hereditary individualism. Here one can see how Hobbes' formal individual, along with a mechanistic system of checks and balances, re-emerged in new cyborgian form to counter the outbreak of civil war. This post-Hobbesian cyborg failed to contain civil war. The modern political rationalism of the English-speaking world was the evolution of a blood feud into a political game of chess between Norman and Saxon. Yet when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, was this checkmate for Lincoln the Conqueror? If this chess game was, in part, premised on hereditary rules, then the real question is who checkmated whom in 1865. On one hand, the destruction of slavery destroyed the means of preserving a Norman cavalier way of life in America. On the other hand, the destruction of slavery meant that Anglo-Saxon nationalism culminated in equality with black slaves. From a kin-selective point of view, 1865 was the consummation of the equality of two lost causes. The American socio-biological cyborg emerged victorious from this will to hereditary mutual destruction. Inevitably, this experiment in democracy culminates in the creator being destroyed by his creation. One of the seminal Norman contributions to the very possibility of American civilization, most evident in the legacy of Magna Carta, was the notion of civilization ruling over culture. It was this Norman-Roman idea that made conceivable the notion that cultures as incompatible as those of the North and the South could be unified under constitutional civilization. The ultimate implication of this idea is that the constitutional state rules over the race. From this point of view, the socio-biological cyborg can be contrasted with Nazi organism. As a point of comparison, consider the following assertion made by Hitler at the Party Congress of 1934. It is not the state which commands us, but rather we who command the state. It was not the state that created us, but rather we who created the state. 1301. In 1937, The Nazi periodical Rhine Front affirmed primarily we are not citizens of states but racial comrades. 1302 Hitler thought that he state is a means to an end, the highest end being the preservation and promotion of his race, not any particular state. States which do not serve this purpose are misbegotten monstrosities. In fact, the American Constitution represents the exact opposite principle. The state commands the race. Memes rule over genes. Ultimately, to preserve the state is to betray the race. The attempt of Normans and Saxons to use the state for conflicting hereditary means, simultaneous with the formal use of individualism as a means of weakening one another as hereditary bodies, ultimately meant betraying one another as hereditary bodies. Building upon the biblical notion of God ruling over men, the polysociobiological cyborg of America is a product of the attempt to replace the rule of men with the rule of law. In fact, this difference of the rule of law over the rule of man is one of the most important elements that define the American political machine as a cyborg. The result of this situation is that Constitution holds the basic, legalized monopoly of authority as the definer of the nature of the state. Individual rights, not kinship relationships between individuals, predominate. This situation can present a conflict of interest between a gene-selective strategy and a meme-selective strategy. It seems that the selfish memes of the Constitution have silently affected their own declaration of independence from the genes that created them. The American founders inadvertently laid, in the form of the Constitution, a hidden blueprint for the genetic overthrow of its creators, and universalized the rule of God-out monarchy over the entire biological human race.